Hello everyone, my name's Amy and I'm chairing this discussion panel today. Thank you all for being here and thank you so much to all of our amazing speakers who have joined us for this panel. For those of you who don't know me, I work for Gavin and Deborah, and for those of you who aren't familiar with The Great Imagining, it's a transformative program for schools and education surrounding critical thinking and progressive learning. And today we are joined by lots of incredible people, and we are going to be discussing the human ecosystem. How do we relate to ourselves? So this panel will be discussing responses surrounding the following questions in relation to physical environment, mental well-being, community, society, trauma, belief, identity, psychology, mortality, and the future of education. The three main questions which I'll be proposing to the speakers are: how do we perceive the world and what do we contribute? How do we define our identities and what secures our health and well-being? So I'm now going to ask our speakers one by one to share their responses surrounding these topics and themes and their thoughts. So first up is Rachel, who is here. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Amy. Do you want me to start? I know we're quite time.
That's okay. No need to feel rushed, but yeah, it would be great if you could just start by sharing your thoughts on these things.
Okay, so I've just put a little time here. Deborah invited me to talk about trauma. Very quickly, my background is both as a journalist as an academic, and I'm currently doing a PhD in creative writing, but all my research is around writing on trauma. So I've done a lot of thinking and investigation around what is trauma, how do we talk about it, how do we think about it, what is our understanding, and you know, I really feel like the reason why we're almost kicking off with this, and I've talked about it with Deborah, is I would describe it as a category 1 issue or a category 1 dilemma. It's a unifying human experience. It's really big and it affects everybody. And I think we are really just now at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding trauma. I think, and just how we're all touched by it in some way. And I think really, if we're going to progress as a species, as a race, we really need to understand the ways in which we all experience trauma and how that affects our perception of our identities and how we interrelate with other people. So just to give you an example of how we're at the tip of this iceberg, you know, we're only just now really beginning to understand the concept of developmental trauma, which is trauma before you're even born. It's trauma that happens in the womb. And it's caused by hormones that the mother is releasing into her bloodstream, cortisol, adrenaline, stress hormones that are going, you know, causing a kind of trauma that's pre-birth. So this is a huge area that we're only just beginning to understand. Another big area that we're only really just beginning to understand the consequences of is collective trauma. Obviously, you know, we've all been very highly aware of the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter protests, but really that's the tip of the iceberg of the Black apocalypse and slavery and the collective trauma around that that's passed down from generation to generation to generation. My husband is Irish. Again, we have the Irish trauma of going back hundreds of years. We probably don't really understand the collective trauma here in Europe of World War II and all those men who came back after the war with PTSD that was never diagnosed. So, and that passed on to their children and their children's children, which is us, our generation. Then we have climate trauma, which is an entirely new category of trauma, which again, we probably don't even understand all the ways we are affected by our disconnected, broken relationship with nature and the planet. Another kind of area where we're just beginning to understand how trauma affects us is we kind of understand big trauma. We understand, you know, sexual violence can be a very traumatic experience, but really trauma can be very small. And just to give you an example of that, I've just finished reading the memoir by the former Guardian journalist Deborah Orr, who sadly died of cancer a year ago, and she's talking about her childhood and a very early childhood experience. She was sent out to play for the first time, and the neighbour next door stole her christening bracelet, and she was trying to make friends, and this one tiny incident of having her christening bracelet stolen gave her lifelong social anxiety, you know, which leads me into my second point really, which is it's not the traumatic event, it's the impact. And just to really quickly kind of say, you know, this can have devastating consequences, because what we do is we develop often unconscious behaviours to compensate for this hurt that happened to us. And I want to bring up here Gabor Mate, who some of you might be familiar with. He's a Canadian physician, but he's done some really amazing groundbreaking work on addiction, and really how addiction is a symptom of traumatic experiences. And what happens is, and we all have addiction, by the way, he's not just talking, he's talking about it very broadly, we're all addicted to something. And really he's saying this is a compensating strategy that's been developed by our unconscious to make up for, or to cover up some kind of pain that is unresolved, that we haven't addressed, that we're probably not aware of. He's also done a lot of work around how unresolved trauma actually manifests as physical illness. He's written a really famous book called The Body Says No, and it really is, you know, if we can't resolve our unconscious psychological trauma, it manifests as physical illness. There's a lot of really exciting work now around somatic experience and how trauma is held in the body. And really it's coming from this idea that often when we experience trauma, it bypasses our mental processing, and it goes straight into the body. And that correlates to how trauma, behind most physical illness, and this is really what Gabor Mate says, there's probably some unresolved trauma. And you know, in terms of how this relates to our sense of identity, it's a really painful thing that's happening to us. And not all trauma, but a lot of trauma does happen in childhood where we don't have mechanisms for dealing with, and it goes straight into our unconscious and stays there. And, you know, one of the consequences of that is all this pain that we aren't perhaps even aware of, or we don't really know how to feel or express or process. One of the consequences of that is, I'm sure you've all heard of the term othering or projection. You know, what happens is we project it onto others. So we have this kind of broken relationship with ourselves that becomes, you know, blaming other people. And we see this in racism, we see it in transphobia, we see it in even within kind of well-intentioned social justice movements, we see it in division. So this is really very, I'm trying to say all of this in a nutshell, how trauma kind of ricochets outwards. And I think the key takeout before I move on to the positives is that broken people lead to broken societies. Okay, big topic, but that's my headline, and Deborah said stick to headlines. So where does this take us into you know, almost the sort of dysfunctional consequences of unresolved trauma? I think there's a direct link between trauma and narcissism. Okay, Amy, stop me if we go for time. Okay, yeah, I mean, narcissism is really, we think narcissists, you know, have grandiose personalities and they love themselves, but really it's based on actually deep insecurity and wanting to make other people feel inferior so we can feel better. And it's a product of this covering up behavior of unresolved trauma. And we can see it in a rise in, we've got narcissistic leaders, haven't we, running the countries, personality disorders, an increase in bullying and abusive behavior, where we're projecting outwards the pain that we can't feel on the inside. And just to kind of give a current example from the pandemic, you know, I've been struck by, you know, my hairdresser is an anti-vaxxer, and she's somebody I know very well. She's been cutting my hair for years. And I was trying to understand why she believes what she does. And really, one of the experiences of trauma is a loss of control. And suddenly we're in this big experience, which potentially is another kind of source of collective trauma, the consequence of the pandemic. We're not in control, we're being told what to do. She's looking for something to blame. So she's developed a story around, oh, well, you know, QAnon, and we're all going to be, I don't know, Bill Gates is going to put chips in us and turn us into zombies. And she's, you know, it's a form of othering. And the danger is, she's, you know, not taking responsibility. Obviously, it is something that's happening outside of her. But the danger is, you know, it's coming from a real pain of loss of control, feeling of isolationism, but it's shifting the problem away. And I think what I want to talk about in terms of what the positives are, and what a lot of my research has been around, is really the importance of shadow work, which is inner work. And again, if you take the pandemic as another example of how, you know, trauma can be a teacher. For every crisis is an opportunity to learn something new and to reset. And really shadow work, it's a concept from depth psychoanalysis, and it's really looking at the unconscious to start to really unpack, you know, where these unconscious beliefs have come from. So instead of projecting them outwards onto other people, we can start to kind of look at ourselves and take responsibility for that. Now, this happens in therapy a lot, but I think really what we need as a society is a much more kind of universal, democratized, accessible kind of reframing and repackaging of this scenario that happens in therapy. How can we roll it out in a way that's, you know, tangible and real to people? What kind of frameworks and packages can we have? And I think this is where education comes in. You know, how can we teach this emotional literacy at school level? How can it be embedded in the education system? And, you know, the point about this is to take responsibility for our pain and our emotions, not to victimize ourselves, which is one of the kind of perhaps dangers, you know, but it's about to be aware so that we can integrate the things that make us feel uncomfortable. And that leads me around, I think we need to kind of have this framework for shadow work that is accessible and universal and democratized. And I think we need stories around this. And a really good example is, I don't know if people saw on BBC One, Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You. I think it was an absolutely brilliant example of shadow work on the ground, how it works. And she goes through this whole journey. She's a victim of sexual violence, she's raped. She goes through this whole journey of othering and blaming. And in the end, redemption is found, not when her rapist is convicted, but when she learns to face her own demons and make peace with herself and make peace with the people around us. And it's if you haven't seen it, watch it, but it's a great example of how shadow work works, but also the kind of stories we need to be telling, whether that's in film or literature or TV or art, that really direct us towards these healing narratives that don't dumb down or over sentimentalize happy endings, but really introduce us to non-binary thinking, which I think is at the core of shadow work. It's about holding opposites. It's about holding good things and bad things that happen to me without really putting a value judgment on them. And what really excites me about young people and future generations is that already we're starting to think about gender in a non-binary way. You know, what happens if we can start to think more broadly in a non-binary way so that we can hold the tension of opposites? And rather than projecting what we feel uncomfortable with outwards, we can start to work through it and process it. And really, when we start, you know, we all suffer, we all experience trauma, which brings me back to my original point. But, you know, quite often we ask ourselves the big existential question, why do we suffer? What's suffering for? And I think I just want to end on you know, the root of the word compassion. Compassion it means passion means to suffer, and compassion means to suffer with, and it's learning through suffering how we can extend and expand empathy towards suffering with others. And I think that's the real value of shadow work, and how trauma can be a teacher, pain can be a teacher, and how, you know, that really the fundamental importance, thinking about positive futures, of more education around shadow work and its purpose, more accessibility, more storytelling. Okay. And I shall leave you with those thoughts.
Thank you so much, Rachel. As you said, that's such a broad topic, but thank you so much for shedding such insight in the limited time we have. Really, that was very informative and wonderful to hear. Thank you. So
just one more thing, sorry, I forgot to mention. Fairy tales, in terms of storytelling, fairy tales are the original shadow work. And when we're talking about working with children, we need to reclaim fairy tales back from their Disneyfication. So that was another point. Just before we move on, I'll let you introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that will lead in nicely to our next speaker, who is Clancy. So Clancy, if you'd like to take it away. Well, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Right, that's better then. So we've got the heavy topics first. I'm going to talk a little bit about mortality. It's something that has never been so much at the top of our national and global agenda since the Second World War. The pandemic is a very traumatic experience for lots of children, but I think one thing that we might be able to take out of it and make advances on is how we look at mortality. I have had a few brushes with mortality. Believe me, you never want to be sitting in front of a doctor who says you're cancer. That's quite scary. It was also very interesting, and it shaped my life ultimately in a very positive way. Something that was much more difficult was when my partner died at the age of 47, which was 11 years ago, and obviously that's had a massive impact. And going through that actually made me feel quite angry about our attitude towards mortality in this country. We hide behind euphemisms such as passed away, or even worse, past, which sounds like a really nasty gallstone. I've got an Irish background and a Jewish background, and the attitude towards death in both those cultures is a lot more open, which brings me to the changes that I would like to see. I think there's definitely a space for talking about death and mortality in education. We shouldn't have to normalize talking about it. It's inevitable. Like the saying is, death and taxes are the two inevitabilities. Different cultures, as I mentioned, the Irish way of looking at death and the Jewish way of looking at death. Lots of different cultures have got different things to contribute. I would just like to see a space in the curriculum to discuss this so that mortality becomes a bit less traumatic, if that's possible. Talking about how we perceive the world, the massive sea change that I've lived through, that I'm very grateful to have had a pre-internet experience, because the big change that has happened now is that people perceive the world very much through the filter of the internet. And we need to think about, we're in the age of information, but we need to think about how we reskill and upskill to deal with all that information. I think Rachel just mentioned the anti-vaxxing movement. I think that's key to what is going on now, because whilst we've got an A level in critical thinking needs to be taught right from the very beginning, and that just boils down to really simple questions. Who told you that stuff? Why did they tell you that stuff? Is it true? And what's your opinion on it? And then going on to, how do we define our identities? Well, I kind of like to say, I've got a little bit of a list, not comprehensive and short. So how do we define our identities? Well, how about the Beatles, the Spice Girls, Stormzy, Turner, Banksy, Vaughan Williams, Jane Austen, Shakespeare, Mr. Bean, Monty Python? Those are the things that just came straight out of my head. If you think about Danny Boyle's brilliant introduction to the Olympics, that just absolutely nailed us as a country. And what I'm saying in a slightly convoluted way is, it's our culture, it's our arts that define our identity in this country. And we need to value them. We don't need a government that's saying, well, we know you've put all this, years of dedication into becoming a ballerina, but perhaps you should just give that dream up and retrain for tech. That's terrifying. And it's something that we need to address as an emergency. And the last thing, what secures our health and well-being? Really simple. I think, ironic since I'm on a panel talking, there's far too much broadcast. Two people are on broadcast too much. We need to have a bit more receive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clancy. That was great. Really interesting points you drew there. I'm going to move swiftly on to Cyprian, if you would like to say your piece. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. All very interesting, the former two speakers, but I think I've been asked here basically because from my own personal experience, one of the hopes that I have discovered is that people like Amy, the younger generation, they seem to have and desire a greater awareness of self. It's something I'm very happy about in the sense that they are able to define and create their own systems for self-identification. Of course, being a person of color, African Caribbean person, or is the more favorable term that I've started using, someone who receives racism, experiences racism on a daily basis. It is important that you know from whence you came, the traditions of your people, your heritage, and that I have felt has fortified me in stating who I am and what I am. Of course, it also helps that you have parents who are understanding of you asserting ownership of who you are in your queerness or in your sexual preference, but most importantly, in trying to define yourself. Once you do that, I think it's easier to accept other people, and the notion of imposing your value system on other people becomes less likely. Not all of us share the same cultural experiences, but we do share human attributes that make us incredibly interconnected. Hence the reason, again, another youthful idiom that I'm very pleased about is the notion of intersectionality. As a person who experiences racism every day, intersectionality is not something new to me. It is something that I've been practicing and my forebears have been practicing for centuries. The way it's codified now gives me hope. And I hope from my personal experience and my extensive eye for observation, reading, listening can help me spread that news or allow people to think more of themselves. I mean, one of the things that constantly struck me is knowing yourself. And I think that's the most difficult thing humanity has ever and will ever, hence the struggle to know it comprehensively, with integrity, with grace, is quite important. So that's what I feel, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you very much. I just have a quick question. That was really, really interesting. I was wondering if you had thoughts about how we can see this taking place within the future of education and within the education system in the future.
Well, that'll take a lot of unpacking because, of course, it's a new idiom. It is something that humanity constantly struggles with. How do we unpack the idioms and diktats of our forebears, of our parents, right? And again, because even teachers, as you know, because there's this constant emphasis placed on teachers as though you weren't brought up by a village, right? I mean, and I mean, most of the people I know, they all talk about aunts, uncles, my mother's friends who are like an aunt and uncle. who bring you up. So it's not as though a teacher is there to guide you through a process of a system of examinations. And this is what Deborah is hoping to achieve, that we can be credited not with letters behind our name, but a civic responsibility and a sense of who we are. Now, to do that work, a teacher can guide you the same way we study literature. I studied literature, and of course, I referred everything back to how did it affect me, so that I was not placing great emphasis on external influences, but bringing those external influences back inside of me. I hope that answers your question sufficiently, Amy.
Yes, that does. That's really, really wonderful, really fascinating points you've drawn there, and definitely very important for our future, for our thinking moving into the future.
I mean, and one of the things I want to say, finding the self, as I said, can be most difficult. I've been in therapy for over 10 years. Prior to that, I saw, I think, about 4 or 5 different therapists who just weren't suited to my needs. And it's like you choosing a bra. You don't just buy the first bra that you find. You choose one that gives you the support. And therapy, particularly it's of the mind, it is the most precious item you could commit yourself to in supporting, building, and growing holistically. That's it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And seems to support exactly what most of us have been saying so far. And yeah, thank you very much.
No problem.
So next up we have Samantha Hunt. Sorry, I think you're on mute, Samantha.
Informed. Hi. I think I will start off by just sharing a little bit about what I do. And before that, I just want to say something about allowing space for different ways that we can receive one another. And there's something about this broadcasting the self, connecting, sharing ideas through the form of spoken word. And, you know, we're reliant on that, and it is privileged in our society that we do that. I personally find that if I'm offered too much of that channel of communication, I lose my focus. And so I want to offer something that is an attempt to offer something more embodied in my sharing of some of the ideas that I have. I want to try and uncouple from sharing with a dialogue, a narrative of ideas that I speak, because I think that it's difficult really to receive all of that in that particular way, receive ideas in the form of spoken language. I think that there needs to be pause, there needs to be reorientation. And so I'm going to attempt to do something that acknowledges my desire to not focus on speaking so much. I am an art psychotherapist, so I invite people who have experienced trauma, neglect, abuse to engage in creativity as a way of dialoguing with themselves, opening up channels where pain resides. And I'm also a mindfulness practitioner. I also invite people into spaces where I offer a meditation narrative to help them tune into their bodies, into their sense of themselves and into their experience of themselves in the world. And I do that within the NHS, and I also work within schools, secondary schools specifically. And I'm really interested in this idea of reimagining what the educational system needs to look like, and how creativity plays a crucial role in that reorientating and redeveloping. Because I feel that it is through our own experience of connecting to our creative selves, whatever the channel of creativity is that we use. And it's interesting that certainly when I was at school, there was this dichotomizing of creativity. So I remember when I was about to choose my options, and you had music, you had dance, and you had drama, and you had art, and you could only choose one. And I think if you're a creative person, you're able to engage in all of those channels of communication, all of those creative channels of communication. I see now that engaging in a creative practice really allows us to become more intimate with ourselves. It really propagates the possibility of connecting to who we are in terms of how we've been formed by the world, our parents, the people around us, our communities, our schools, but it also allows us to desocialize, deconstruct, and that is something that we are doing constantly. I'm really saddened when I see what's happening to the creative subjects in schools, because I see that it's an attack on the self-actualizing. It's an attack on the possibility of connections with the self to then develop into connections with other people, with family members, with friends, and with people who perhaps don't share our culture uniforms, with people who we might potentially feel othered by or be othered by. I was interested to contemplate this idea of how we experience ourselves in relationship to other people, how we are formed by how we connect and interrelate. And I think that it's through a creative dialoguing that we really get to platform ourselves and understand who we want to offer the world. And it really does excite me to think about how we can use pictorial space as a way of telling stories about who we are, as a way of sharing ourselves with other people, and as a way of them receiving us and offering themselves back to us. I think that I think creativity is crucial to healing the existential split that we feel. I think it's crucial to managing a sense of isolation. I have been working like all of the people who work for the NHS during lockdown, offering opportunities for people to make sense of their own personal stories within the backdrop of the coronavirus and the resurgence of the Black Lives Movement and the civil rights movement. Trauma, pain and suffering are experiences that words can't really hold the true form of. And I have borne witness to how difficult it is for the invitation to speak about trauma and pain can be to the person who wants to make sense of the experience. Time and time again, I've seen that it is through attention being given to offering a piece of paper and a drawing material, and inviting someone just to begin wherever they need to begin on the page, to invite them to begin to make contour and shape and form of their felt sense experience of trauma and pain and suffering. And it is at that point that people can then begin to consider what words could be shaped to begin to articulate how it feels. I think it can be very overwhelming to be invited to talk, and it can also be re-traumatizing begin to tell the story of one's pain and suffering. I think art making offers a really lovely boundary, a space in between where you can observe yourself and notice and allow and feel and make sense of and reshape. And I think during times like this, when we're experiencing this cataclysmic confluence of collective trauma, it's when we need to rely on the arts to help us heal. And that does need to begin in schools. It does need to begin in places where we're offering teaching and offering opportunities for young people to be received and influenced and midwiferyed into becoming themselves. And they know what they need to do. They know how to do it. I think schools should be really tasked with holding the space for that developing, rather than this pedagogy of kind of top-down teaching. It needs to be more collaborative, and that happens with the arts.
Thank you so much. I'm really appreciative for your words there, and definitely you mentioned a lot of things which relate to me specifically as a young person who's recently been in the education system, especially within arts education. So I think those points you've raised are vital. Likewise to all the previous speakers so far. As a young person, your words are so affirming to hear, and yeah, this is really great, and I'm very grateful for your wisdom. So moving on, next we have Dr. Thana Bala. Sorry, you're just on mute, I think. Sorry.
Hi, thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm a bit of background about me. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work in central London. I actually worked with Samantha for a bit. I work at the more severe end of mental health problems with an inpatient men's ward who've experienced a lot of trauma, and kind of we're dealing with a lot of those traumatic issues as well as large social factors. I'll go through the points that you raised about kind of how we perceive the world. It's quite interesting what other people have said, because I think what's worth remembering is that how you perceive the world is very kind of filtered by our life experiences, including the trauma and other things that have happened. And that affects your subjective truth as well. So I think the way that you perceive the world affects what your definition of reality is. And somebody mentioned earlier about the anti-vaxxers, for example. So they are coming from a position which is kind of, there's a reason why they've kind of filtered the information they've received in a particular way. As another one of, I think Clancy said that, because so much of young people's information is coming through the internet, which is kind of filtered in a slightly different way and not in a direct connection with another person, that also kind of influences the way that people kind of interpret information or gather their information. So I suppose related to that is also this thing about how you define our identities. And I think more recently people feel pushed into having an identity that then sticks to them. And yet we know that identity kind of changes through the life cycle, through interactions with other people, through your life experiences. And maybe part of what identity politics has done is it's made you feel the need to identify yourself a particular way, which is necessarily means you've been categorized. And I just think particularly James Baldwin wrote it particularly well about how he didn't think of himself in the category as a black man until he realized that was how the white man constructed him. And before that, he was just himself. I think it would be useful to go back to thinking about how you feel and relate to other people and the world around you, rather than labeling yourself as a way that other people should see you. I mean, I think it's useful to have an identity, and the part of kind of growing up and forming an integral or having integrity is to have an identity. But we have to remember that that can be that's more about your view of yourself rather than the way that you wish other people to see you. And I suppose so that moves on to the next one about kind of what does secure our health and well-being. Is that there's so many different definitions of that, and having a coherent sense of self is one of them. And obviously not all over the world, but we have generally kind of in the West moved beyond the basic needs of finding and having enough food and shelter and safety. Well, until recently, the pandemic's kind of awoken those kind of fears again. But the pandemic has also shown that we really, really need the ability to connect in real terms with other people. And that's what's been highlighted, and that's what we've lost most recently. And I think that's the biggest problem that society has at the moment, is that we're not able to connect in a real way with other people. It's either done through the media, or it's done through kind of arguing on Twitter, or however people are doing it. And without that real connection, everything is kind of becomes measured or kind of documented in a particular way. So again, it's also the other issue about mortality, is that without a real interaction, without everything being kind of seen through a virtual world, you're not facing up to the reality of things ending, or facing up to the inevitability of us all ending, which I think without facing up to that, you're not going to kind of come to terms with the reality of what's happening now. I mean, my background also is that I set up a group really looking at the mental health and the arts. And I think what Sam's saying about the arts is very interesting, because it's through the arts that you can actually tolerate that kind of uncertainty and explore things in a less, as you say, pedagogic way, or a less kind of obviously described, obviously kind of documented way. It allows a lot more blurring of the kind of the edges and the exploration. And one definition of trauma, which I always find quite interesting, is that it's that which cannot be conveyed. So, or certainly cannot be conveyed with words. And I think words are very important, but the way they can be used, they're also very powerful. And I think not having the constraints of words, but other ways of communicating through the arts, for example, are very useful for kind of processing trauma and understanding what's happened to us as a species and in our relationship with the world and our sense of self. So I suppose, yeah, that's really all I've got to say. And those are the initial thoughts that came up from the discussion so far.
Thank you very much, Bala. I have got a couple of questions, but I will save them till the end. That was really, really interesting. So next, we've got Jo Willis, if you would please like to share.
Hello, yeah, call me out if I go on too long, and hello everybody, and thank you very much. It's very nice to share Zoom land with you, which is what I call it these days, because I meet a lot of the people I work with only on Zoom land. So I'm the founder and creative director of what became an arts charity called Chill Out. I'm based in Cornwall, so that gives me a slightly different perspective to a lot of people. Actually, I see myself very much as a Celt in some ways, in the ways I look at things. So when I was first invited, it was about this sort of ideal, and then we've now got the 3 questions. My ideal, and I was also asked because I have experience of working with people who have learning disabilities or physical disabilities, or who are vulnerable and outside in society. And I see myself very much at this time being involved in climate awareness and all that sort of thing, because I feel they're vulnerable and their voice isn't necessarily heard. And I think it's wonderful to hear about community and how everybody wants to outreach and trauma, because that, you know, those are our collective experience. So the first thing I really wanted to mention was universal design, and that's around buildings and places and people. If you initially design something for everybody, that sets up a lot, that sorts out a lot, doesn't it? You know, if everyone can get in the room, everyone can communicate, everyone can hear each other, everybody feels understood. We've started already with a great place. Universal design comes from architecture, but it also means, you know, has this got BSL on it? Has this got captioning? You know, have we made it available to all the different elements of society? Who can understand it? Who is in the room? If some people aren't in the room, it's our fault. Okay, I come from middle-class white background. I have a lot of stuff to sort out. You know, I am privileged, I'm entitled, I owe a lot. You know, the Black Lives Matter movements, all those things are so important to make us look at where we are and where we come from. So I believe in universal design. I believe in healing the environment. Just for example, you know, you get children who use wheelchairs in schools these days, but I asked if I could use a dance studio in the school opposite me once, and they said, yes, but you can't have wheelchairs because they'll mark the floor. So it's very simple, you know, it's things like that. I believe in people first. So I believe that we're all people, we all have a right to be here. What we choose as our identity, when we talk about identity and contribution, those change all the time throughout our lives. Sometimes I can contribute and give back a lot in the worldly sense. Sometimes I can't at all, but actually by not, what is contribution? Anyway, if I'm here and I need to be loved, I'm a contribution. You know, it takes a village to raise a person. I think that's such a beautiful thing. It's so important. We all need each other. So I don't have to contribute to be of value. The very thought that I am is enough to be of value. I have a changing identity. You know, people look at me, I'm a mother of 5, and they say, oh, you're a mother. I didn't feel like a mother till some of my children left home. I have a huge investment in our education system. My first daughter was a child refuser. 4 of my children were home educated. Because school didn't work for them. So I won't rampage on about what I think is wrong with school. Obviously, I think it doesn't fit a lot of people, particularly people around autism, ADHD, high creativity. I've worked in institutions. Talk about trauma. I worked in a hospital that was called for people who had mental handicap. It was an old workhouse. A quick story just about environment is I used to have to pull down 2 handles, open the door, and on the formica floor of this particular area was a young man lying. And I knew him, and I knew he came from a loving family, and he was very, very physically disabled. He could smile, he could make noises, he couldn't talk clearly. And I knew his family must have handed him over to this institution because they couldn't manage with him at home. And it was appalling. You walked in, there was nothing anywhere. It was all empty. Everyone sat facing in on themselves next to where the toilets were. There was nothing within the building and you couldn't see out the windows. This is only 30 years ago in our society. You know, there is trauma, and people who have labels around learning disabilities and physical disability have a huge amount of trauma, which goes into the body, which is very interesting. And they also, they lack a voice. When the disability movement came out years ago, people with mental health and mental disability are not really in the room. They are more in the room now. So one of the things, if we talk about heritage and where we come from and trauma, there's an awful lot to look at. I think it's really important that birth and death should be in our world and discussed. I think that's important. 4 of my children were born at home. And we've had people die in our house. We've visited. I think it's really important that birth and death are in our worlds and are talked about. They just, you know, when I die, I want to be laid out in the table at home, you know, and I want my friends to come and visit me, and then I want to be buried in a couple of days. I don't want to be taken off in a sack to some strange place. So for people who have Down syndrome, the whole abortion thing is a big matter, and I just want to bring it up, and I just want to leave it in the room for us all to think about. There was a person many years ago who was on television who had Down syndrome, and when he was told that people choose abortion if they know they have a child with Down syndrome coming into the world, he said, "That doesn't make me feel good." What are we doing? What are we doing to people? It's unbelievable. I can't believe it. And I don't talk a lot about the trauma of having a learning disability with the people I work with, because I don't want to reinforce that for them, that actually society might not value them or didn't value them. It's hard enough to live in society as it is with all that's going on. So I believe greatly in the creative process, and I didn't keep an eye on the time, so I don't know, maybe I should shut up soon. I suppose my last thing really is that I make spaces where it's particularly open to people who have a learning disability to access them, but they're open, interesting, creative spaces. We work with the creative process, so everyone can come in, and lots of people choose to come in and join and be there. And I feel we need those spaces in the world, not particularly segregated spaces, but places which are open and supportive of marginalised groups, but attractive to everyone else. So you're not going in as a volunteer, you're going in as a person to work together. Within schools and things, I believe an idea of like a sort of a ladder, that we have on one side, we have technique, which is terribly rigid. And on the other side, we have our own voice, which can be a little bit rather loose and go a bit sort of wonky. We need both. We need to allow children to learn technique, but to have their own voice from the very beginning of their art experience, and for it to go between the two. So that, you know, as has been beautifully said, art is a way of expressing ourselves and communicating. And I really believe in non-verbal art forms, in gestural communication, and that symbolism that happens through gestural communication and art reaches everybody. And I believe that I want a society where everyone's in the room, really. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful. Thank you for sharing and raising awareness and shedding light on your incredible work. We are nearly coming to the end of our time, so I would like to ask Sarita to please speak lastly, and thank you all so much to everyone who's spoken so far. You've been truly wonderful.
So hi Amy, hi everyone. My name is Sarita, and who am I is something that I'm actually exploring right now. I can't actually tell you that I have a solid, well, I don't know if any of us have solid identities, but it's a conversation I'm having with myself right now, and I'm exploring that through writing a one-person show about an experience that I'm going to share with you now. I think what I want to contribute to this conversation is my own experience of having something incredibly difficult to deal with in my childhood and school. So how those two things sat together. And I think I want to share this as a way of showing and looking at what was missing that maybe could have made a difference to the experience of that young child. One of the things I'm playing with at the moment is the idea of what we silence is political, and I think the thing about using the word trauma is that it is a word, and it's a word that when we say it, maybe all of us can think of a traumatic moment in our lives. But what I want to do is actually tell you the traumatic thing, and then kind of unpack, not in its entirety, obviously, because we don't have time for that, but just this idea of unpacking it, so that actually it's not the word trauma that we have out in the world, but it's actually the experiences. I think that by sharing actually the what's so, gives other people permission to share the what's so. And if we could all share the what's so, then it brings it out. And inside of bringing it out in community, there is just a tiny more, a bit of truth, a little bit more truth. So the traumatic experience that I suppose the biggest traumatic experience is when I was at school, and my siblings were at school and they were a bit older. we had I grew up in Glasgow, first of all, and the local newspaper was, or one of the local newspapers is a Daily Record. And one day, the front page of the Daily Record had a humongous photograph of my dad and my mum. And the headline read, 12 years for the callous wife killer, the evil butcher, death, then he skinned and jointed her body. Each of the children at the school, obviously their parents read this newspaper, and my siblings went to school that morning without having seen the newspaper themselves. And then subsequently what happened was, the children, not all the children, but some of the children were asking questions about this incident that was on the newspaper. And, so the types of questions they were asking is, oh my God, did your dad chop up your mom? Did, your dad, all kinds of really horrendous things. So, and what happened in school was a silence. The thing to do was to not talk about it. The thing to do was to stay quiet. And if you stay quiet, then eventually it goes away. And it goes away for the people around you, the teachers, the other parents, the children. Obviously it goes away, but it never goes away for for the people closest to, for my family. It never went away. And then inside of that as well, I did not inside of that, but as a professional, I was a lecturer for 6 years, and inside of that, I did a postgraduate in higher education. And one of the things that I had to do was look at a problem in my teaching and learning. And the problem that I discovered is that my students were not thinking critically about their subject. They were not producing critical work. So I looked at my own practice, and I looked at, I took it all the way back to how I learn. And what I discovered in that process was that I did not learn through critical, I never thought critically about anything that I ever did. The only thing I could ever do was to copy. I can only copy. And what I discovered was I could only copy because I never felt safe enough to be creative, and feeling safe enough to be creative was the thing that would allow me the freedom to be more critical about something. And so I think I wanted to show this as a way of an impact that trauma has on education, on your ability to learn, on your ability to feel safe enough and free enough to be able to really think about what's going on and be, so I suppose the safeness of that, the safe space. And, I know that what I've just shared something that's very horrendous in this space right now. But that's what I have to share. That's what happened. That's the what's so. So yeah, I just want to think about how when you have trauma, when you have sexual abuse, when you have physical violence at home, when you have parents that separate or parents that argue and shout and fight a lot, when you have poverty and, you're hungry, and those experiences, and then you come into school, and what you want to do is be like everybody else at school. So it all gets silenced and it all gets hidden. And I suppose what my question really is, how do we create an environment where it's really okay to share those really traumatic things that are going on, and how do we deal with those things how do we be community? How do we be community when
Sorry, Sarita. I think I'm gonna have to cut you short there, although I'd like to really acknowledge some of the things you just shared, and I'm aware that was very personal, but I really appreciate you sharing for the benefit of all of us who needed to hear that. So thank you.
Can I just say as well, Amy, though, that it is personal, but it's also not, because it is collective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so we now are at the end of our time for speaking. I'd like to say thank you again, deeply, honestly, to everyone who just shared. I feel incredibly inspired by all of your words, and also very, very supported and reassured as a young person to have people around me and to be in this space with people sharing their thoughts, who are so dedicated to transforming a future that is going to determine and affect my life so massively, and my children's lives. So thank you, everyone. You all had such inspiring things to say, and I'm sure anyone watching right now will have felt the same. So I am just gonna have a look through and see if we have any questions. And also I did mention at the beginning that if you had any questions for each other, that we could go through those in this time. We have to wrap up at 11:10, but does anyone, I've got a question now from Lavina. So if you'd like to start, Lavina, with your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to start by saying thank you, Amy, for moderating this incredible panel, and for everyone for sharing all of their stories. I've been sitting here inspired and just nodding along to everything and feeling so, I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for the last 10 years, and I've taken a recent break from teaching because I've been really questioning what the role of an educator is. And it's just so inspiring for me to learn from all of your experiences and your, everything that you've been doing. It's sort of a question and a comment, which is that I felt like I needed to take a pause from teaching young people, because when I was teaching art and discussing artworks, I felt, particularly because of the nature of my subject, I guess, history of art, it brought up so many personal experiences for students, and I was really excited by this, and I felt that that's what I wanted to try and come across in my teaching, and kind of create a space where students could share ideas on identity, ideas on experiences they'd had that might have been traumatic, or really exciting things that had happened in their life. But I felt as a teacher it was incredibly difficult to kind of hold this space, both having kind of my subject hat on, and then my sort of thinking about mental well-being for students. And I remember a session where I was talking about identity, and a student kind of started having what I could recognize as a sort of slight breakdown in the class, and then I didn't have enough support to hold her space and the rest of the classroom together. And I guess it's not really a question, it's just I think, Cyprian, you were talking earlier about the importance of the role as a teacher to guide students, and I know that this has come up also in, Samantha, your work, when you were talking about using art as a way to deal with a student's experiences, and it's really come up in all of your conversations. And I guess what I'm thinking about in terms of the Great Imagining and just the future of education in general is just to really rethink the role of the teacher, not just as a fact provider, because students increasingly don't want a teacher that just gives them facts. I don't know, when I teach in front of an architecture building and someone says, how high is this? I'm like, oh, I think it's 2.5 meters. And then someone's Googled up saying, no, Lavinia, actually it's 2.75 meters. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But do you know what I'm trying to say is, like, students have availability of facts nowadays so readily with the internet. And I just wonder whether there's something to be said also to, rethink the way that teachers can be trained to feel more empowered to really help their students. Because I think anyone who's been teaching or working with young people, you know that you need to think about their mental well-being as well as what you're teaching them. A happy student, or a student that feels safe, can learn from you, and I think those two have been separated quite a lot in the past. So it's not really a question, it's kind of a contribution. I'm just really grateful for all of your everything that I've learned from you all today. Thank you. So nerve-wracking talking on this sort of Zoom land where you can't quite see me, but anyway, I hope you've understood that.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Amy, can I just respond to that just really quickly? I want to say that's a really, really fantastic question, and one that is that we need to put a lot of thought to, you know, because and it's literally rethinking absolutely everything inside of that, because otherwise it doesn't work. You know, I mean, it's such an important question to.
I think, is that a little hand there, Joe?
I was just going to say, I think, you know, well, my dad, my dad was a GP and my mum was a nurse. And I think there's something about vocation, which has got really lost. It got lost in the 80s, really. I mean, I got sent around something saying our clients in the NHS. Clients? I broke my leg. I chose who I wanted to go to? No, patient. You know, I think it's something about the vocational role of a teacher, that they should care for their children. And if people don't care, and they don't, and there's this wonderful story of a child going around like, why don't the teachers like children? You know, it's like one of the first things is to like the people you work with, and then to care for them, and not to put so much on people like GPs and teachers now, that they're meant to be the all for everybody. You know, they're a doorway. When people come to us, we teach, we work, we don't teach, we facilitate outside of all the sort of normal ways of working. And we guide people, we'll steer people to somewhere else. So we're not the answer, but if someone comes to us with trauma, we would, you know, send them somewhere else or support them with it. So I think it's that, for me, when I work in my work, I say if someone needs creativity, they need it for the rest of their life. They don't maybe need to do it with me for the rest of their life, but they need it for the rest of their life. So I think we just have to really look at, you know, how we view jobs, how we view vocation, how we view care. I think that whole thing is a team, isn't it? It's a whole team of people, and that's what we need, and that's what is really good to listen to here. So I think, you know, teachers have to have a lot of support, as do children.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to.
Sorry.
I just wanted to quickly add to that. I mean, we're all aware of how waterboarded teachers are with the bureaucracy of teaching, and how the languaging around educating is around academic attainment. I think that has to be dissolved. And I think there are practices available that teachers need to be enabled to embody, like a mindfulness positioning, where you're really engaging in your role as an educator as a collaboration. And that has to really sit within you, the intention to do that, to actually open up the space for dialoguing with students has to sit within you first and foremost, and then you can allow it from your students.
Yeah, thank you so much.
To that as well, if I may, and just sort of drawing threads, I've just written a list of kind of common themes that have come out that connect to Lavinia's point, which is creating a safe space. And a few people mentioned this notion of receiving, and also tied into kind of really a kind of lack of really solid critical thinking skills. And I think, to me, this all relates to this idea of listening. And speaking now as a teacher, you know, I find in my own experience of teaching within higher education, so I'll be teaching, you know, 18 to kind of early 20s, I learn so much from my students when I listen to them. And again, it's not really taught in pedagogy, you know, this idea of what teachers can learn from their students, and it starts with listening, and you know, we can teach students to listen by modeling listening. And I think there's something really big in this whole idea of receiving, listening. What is the pedagogy around learning to listen, and the role of listening in creating a safe space, and the role of listening in critical thinking and listening to the voices and stories of others, and before steamrolling in and judging. And I see this so much with social media, and we talk about it so much with our students. You're not really listening, you're jumping in with an opinion and a comment before you've really actually given space to what it is the person is trying to say. So just to kind of, I guess, draw some threads perhaps and throw something else out there around this idea of listening. How can we learn to listen better?
Thank you. We have 1 minute left, and I would just like to conclude by saying that, as I mentioned earlier, as someone who is still really young and still the experience of education is very fresh for me, I would just like to emphasize my feelings through this talk, that if I'd felt like these things had been said to me during that time or were implemented in my education, I think that my experience of who I am and my awareness of who I am today would be so much more comfortable and well-rounded and peaceful. Like, I would think I would have so much more, I think I would feel so supported. And I just really, really do hope that in the future all of these things can really come into play. And it is honestly so inspiring and relieving to finally be in a space where these things are being talked about. So thank you all so much for coming today and sharing truly words of wisdom. Thank you. And hopefully we will all get a chance to see each other more and speak more in depth about these incredibly complex and intricate topics. But in the time restraints that we had, that was so amazing from every single one of you. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all and see you all if I already knew you. And yeah, that is it. That's it from me. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you.
You.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.